Winterfell stood strong against the cold northern winds, its gray stone walls soaked in the golden light of late afternoon. The yard bustled with activity. Servants hurried to and fro. Stable hands fed the horses, and in the center, Robb Stark and Jon Snow clashed wooden swords in a fierce sparring match. Their movements were swift, precise, and full of the unspoken competition that had always burned between them. Bran Stark balanced on the low wall of the training yard, watching his older brothers with admiration. He wanted to be just like them, a warrior, strong and fearless. But for now he was just a boy, still too small for a real sword, still too eager to prove himself. His fingers itched to climb. The broken tower loomed in the distance, its jagged top a challenge he had conquered many times before. He had spent hours scaling Winterfell's walls, testing his limits, defying his mother's warnings. He liked the view from up high. The whole world stretched out beneath him, every secret laid bare. But today he hesitated. His mother's voice echoed in his mind. "One day you will fall, Bran." A gust of wind bit through her cloak, and for the first time doubt crept in. Climbing was second nature to him, but her worry had planted a seed. What if she was right? Instead of heading for the tower, Bran leapt down from the wall and landed with a soft grunt. His legs ached from the impact, but he straightened quickly, brushing off the dust. He turned back to the training yard just as Robb knocked Jon's sword from his hand with a triumphant grin. "Bran!" Robb called, catching sight of him. "Come here." Bran ran over, excitement bubbling in his chest. Jon, still breathing heavily, wiped sweat from his brow. "You've been watching long enough. You want to learn or not?" Bran grinned, nodding eagerly. "I do." Sir Roderick Cassel, the old master-at-arms, stood nearby, his white whiskers twitching as he studied Bran. "Then it's time you held a sword." He reached for the wooden practice blade leaning against the rack and handed it to Bran. Bran wrapped his fingers around the hilt. It was heavier than he expected, and he nearly dropped it. His brothers chuckled, but he tightened his grip, determination hardening his expression. "All right, lad," Sir Roderick said. "Show me what you got." Bran swung. His strike was clumsy, too slow, and Jon blocked it with ease, sending Bran stumbling back. He gritted his teeth and tried again, and again. Each time Jon countered effortlessly, but Bran refused to quit. His arms ached, his fingers throbbed, but he fought through it, fueled by the simple desire to be better. Robb clapped him on the shoulder when they finished. "Not bad for your first time. You'll get there." Bran beamed. He felt strong, capable, and he had never even thought about the broken tower again. Far above, hidden in the shadow of the broken tower, Jaime Lannister watched with narrowed eyes. Beside him, Cersei stood rigid, her breath shallow. She had been the first to notice the boy, had frozen in place when she saw him moving toward the tower. They had been prepared to act. Jaime's hand had already been on the hilt of his sword, but Bran had changed his mind. "He didn't climb," Cersei whispered, as if she didn't quite believe it. Jaime let out a slow breath. "No, he didn't." They stood in silence for a long moment, the weight of the near disaster settling over them. If the boy had seen them together, if he had climbed to that window. Jaime shook the thought away. It didn't happen. There was no need for desperate choices, no need for pushing little boys out of towers. With one last glance down at the yard, where Bran was still practicing with his brothers, Jaime took Cersei's hand and led her back into the shadows. For now at least their secret was safe, and fate had shifted in a way neither of them could predict. That night, Winterfell was alive with laughter and music. Lord Eddard Stark had called for a feast in honor of King Robert's arrival, and the great hall was filled with the scent of roasted meat, spiced wine, and burning firewood. Bran sat between Robb and Jon, still buzzing with excitement from his first day of training. He listened intently to Theon Greyjoy, who was boasting about a battle he had never fought, and Arya, who was sneaking bites from his plate when she thought he wasn't looking. Across the hall, the Lannisters sat together, golden-haired and regal. The queen's face was unreadable, but Jaime seemed relaxed, drinking deeply from his goblet. Bran hardly noticed them. He was more focused on the stories being told by the knights and lords around him. He dreamed of battle, of adventure, of one day standing in a hall like this as a great warrior. The tower was forgotten, and with it, the war that should have started that day. The night air was crisp as Bran walked through the courtyard after the feast. The torches flickered, casting long shadows against the stone walls of Winterfell. He still felt the weight of the practice sword in his hands, the memory of his training fresh in his mind. His arms ached, but it was a good ache, the kind that made him feel stronger. He would train every day. He would get better. Ahead of him, he saw his father speaking with Benjen Stark, the first ranger of the Night's Watch. His uncle had arrived with the king's party and had spent most of the evening in serious conversation with Lord Stark. Bran had always admired Benjen. The stories of the Night's Watch fascinated him, and he had dreamed of what lay beyond the wall. But tonight, something about his uncle's expression troubled him. Bran hesitated, lingering in the shadows near the stables, listening. "Something's not right beyond the wall," Benjen said, his voice low. "I've seen things, Ned. Strange things." His father sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "You're talking about the White Walkers again?" Benjen's face was grim. "I'm telling you, something is coming. The deserters we've caught, those who flee south, they all say the same thing. The dead are walking." Bran shivered. He had heard old Nan's stories of the White Walkers. He had always thought they were just that. Stories. His father remained quiet for a long moment. Then he shook his head. "I trust you, Benjen, but we need proof. We can't start a war over ghost stories." Benjen exhaled sharply. "Just be careful, Ned. If something happens, if the North is threatened, we may not have time to prepare." Bran stayed hidden as his father and uncle walked away. A chill ran down his spine, but he told himself it was just the cold wind. He turned to head inside when a voice stopped him. "You shouldn't eavesdrop, little lord." Bran spun around and found himself face to face with Tyrion Lannister. The dwarf stood leaning against a stone pillar, a goblet in his hand, his sharp eyes glinting with amusement. Bran straightened. "I wasn't eavesdropping," Tyrion smirked. "Of course not. You just happened to be standing in the perfect spot to overhear something interesting." Bran frowned but didn't argue. Tyrion took a sip from his goblet before continuing. "Tell me, boy, do you believe in White Walkers?" Bran hesitated. "I don't know." Tyrion chuckled. "Smart answer. Some would call it nonsense, others would swear by it. But the world is full of things most people choose to ignore." Bran didn't know how to respond, so he simply nodded. Tyrion studied him for a moment. "You remind me of someone. You have that same look in your eyes, the kind that wants to know everything." He straightened and patted Bran lightly on the shoulder. "Keep your eyes open, little Stark. The world is bigger than you think." With that, he turned and strolled away, whistling softly to himself. Bran stood there for a long moment, his mind buzzing with thoughts. Something was coming. He could feel it, and for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure if he wanted to know what it was. Varys stood in the darkness of his chambers, listening. A little bird whispered in his ear, telling him what had transpired in Winterfell. "The boy didn't climb the tower," the whisperer said. Varys folded his hands. That was unexpected. A small change, but small changes had a way of turning into storms. "If the boy never fell, then the Lannisters remain undiscovered," he murmured to himself, "which means Ned Stark's fate is no longer certain." He walked to the window, gazing out over the city. The game was shifting. The pieces on the board were no longer moving as they should, and Varys did not like uncertainty. Winterfell stirred early the next morning. The cold northern sun had barely risen when Bran woke to the sound of men shouting, horses whinnying, and the clang of armor being fastened. The king's party was preparing to leave, and with them, his father. Bran sat up in his bed, his heart sinking. He had hoped it was all a dream. The news that his father was leaving for King's Landing, that he was to serve as Hand of the King, but the sight outside his window confirmed the truth. Robb had already left their chambers. Bran quickly dressed and hurried out, moving through the halls of Winterfell. As he entered the courtyard, he saw his father standing with Sansa and Arya. Sansa was composed, her hands folded in front of her, trying to act like a lady. Arya, on the other hand, stood stiffly, her expression sullen. Jon was nearby, speaking quietly with Benjen. Bran ran toward his father, weaving through the departing knights and servants. "Father!" he called, and Lord Eddard Stark turned toward him. Bran skidded to a stop, suddenly unsure of what to say. He wanted to ask his father not to leave, to stay in Winterfell, where it was safe, where they were together, but he knew better. Lord Stark knelt before him, placing a firm hand on Bran's shoulder. "You'll take care of your mother while I'm gone." Bran nodded, trying to be strong. Ned gave him a small smile. "Good, and you'll keep training. I expect you to be a fine swordsman when I return." Bran swallowed the lump in his throat. "I will." Ned rose and turned to Robb. "Winterfell is yours now. You must rule wisely in my absence." Robb nodded, but there was a hardness in his expression. He was only 15, yet responsibility had already settled heavily on his shoulders. Nearby, Jon finished speaking with Benjen and walked toward Bran. He smiled faintly. "You better practice, little brother. You'll need to be strong if you ever want to wield a real sword." Bran puffed out his chest. "I'll be better than you one day." Jon laughed. "We'll see about that." He hesitated, then leaned in, lowering his voice. "Take care of Arya. She's not happy about leaving Winterfell." Bran nodded, and Jon ruffled his hair before stepping back. Moments later, the royal procession began moving. Horses trotted forward, wheels creaked, and banners fluttered in the wind. The king's men, his father, Sansa, Arya, and Jon all disappeared beyond the gates of Winterfell. Bran stood watching until they were gone. For the first time in his life, Winterfell felt empty. In the shadows of the keep, Jaime Lannister stood watching. The boy had not climbed. The secret had remained hidden. Jaime should have felt relief, but instead, he felt something strange. Unease. He had already been prepared to kill the boy if necessary. It would not have been the first time he had taken a life to protect Cersei. But now fate had shifted. The game had changed. Jaime turned, walking back toward the keep, his mind unsettled. Somehow he had the feeling that they had not escaped as cleanly as they thought. Far to the south in King's Landing, a raven arrived at the Red Keep. Varys unfolded the parchment with delicate fingers, scanning the words quickly. A thoughtful expression crossed his face. "The boy never fell," he murmured. That meant Eddard Stark would not have immediate reason to suspect the Lannisters. It meant the conflict between the Starks and the Lannisters would take longer to ignite. But it also meant something far more dangerous. It meant Bran Stark would never begin his journey north. And without that, the world had just lost the only person who would ever become the Three-Eyed Raven. Varys leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. The ripple effect of this small change had begun. And no one, Stark, Lannister, or Targaryen, was prepared for what was coming. The days after his father's departure felt strange. Winterfell was the same, yet it wasn't. The halls were quieter, the yard felt emptier, and even the great hall seemed colder during supper. Robb was Lord of Winterfell now, and while he carried himself with confidence, Bran could see the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. Bran threw himself into his training. Each morning, he practiced with a wooden sword under Sir Roderick's watchful eye. At first, his swings were clumsy, his grip too weak, but he was determined. Robb trained with him when he had time, offering advice and correcting his stance. Even Theon gave him pointers, though usually with a mocking grin. But Bran didn't care. He was getting stronger. One afternoon, as Bran finished training, Maester Luwin approached him near the stables. "Bran, your mother has requested you join her in the Solar." Bran frowned. "Is something wrong?" Maester Luwin hesitated. "She's troubled. It would do her good to see you." Bran nodded and made his way inside. Catelyn Stark sat near the fireplace, her hands folded in her lap, her expression distant. Since Ned's departure, she had become quieter, more withdrawn. Bran missed the way she used to smile, the warmth she carried when she sat with him and his siblings. "Mother?" he said softly. She looked up, forcing a small smile. "Bran, come sit with me." He climbed onto the chair beside her, waiting. She sighed, staring into the flames. "I should have gone with your father." Bran frowned. "But Winterfell needs you." "I know," she whispered, "but I can't shake the feeling that something is wrong." Bran didn't know what to say. He had overheard the whispers. His mother feared the Lannisters. She didn't trust them. She believed they were responsible for Jon Arryn's death. But Bran had seen nothing. He hadn't climbed the tower. He hadn't seen Jaime and Cersei together. He had no reason to doubt them. Catelyn brushed his hair back gently. "Stay close to your brother. Help him. And no more climbing. Promise me." Bran nodded. "I've been training instead. I want to be a knight." A real smile crossed her lips, fleeting but genuine. "Then I have no doubt you'll be a great one." She kissed his forehead, but even as she held him close, Bran could feel the tension in her body. His mother was afraid, and he didn't understand why. Meanwhile, in King's Landing, Eddard Stark walked through the halls of the Red Keep, his mind troubled. He had barely been in the capital for a fortnight, yet already he sensed the rot beneath its golden surface. King Robert was a shadow of the man he once knew, drunk, careless, uninterested in ruling. The council was full of schemers, each playing their own game. And worst of all, he could feel the weight of the Lannisters everywhere. Still, nothing had given him a clear reason to distrust them. He had received a letter from Winterfell. Catelyn was worried. She had written of her suspicions, of her belief that the Lannisters had played a hand in Jon Arryn's death. But there was no proof, nothing tangible. And without Bran's fall, Without the dagger that had been used in the attempt on his life, there was no reason for open hostility. Littlefinger had still whispered his honeyed words of caution. Varys had still warned him to tread carefully. But there was no immediate spark of war. Not yet. Eddard knew the game was being played around him. He just didn't know how deep he was already in it. Far beyond the wall, the cold wind howled as the Rangers moved through the snow-covered woods, their torches flickering against the darkness. Benjen Stark rode at the front, his eyes scanning the trees. Something was wrong. He had felt it for weeks now. Tracks in the snow that led nowhere. Corpses that disappeared before they could be examined. The feeling of being watched, always just beyond the reach of firelight. He pulled his horse to a stop. He said, "Hold," quietly. The other rangers obeyed, falling silent. The woods were too still, not even the distant cry of an owl. Benjen dismounted, his hand on the hilt of his sword. He took a step forward. The sound of crunching snow behind him made him turn. His breath caught in his throat. A figure stood at the edge of the torchlight, pale, motionless, eyes burning blue. Benjen barely had time to react before the dead man lunged at him. Benjen Stark barely had time to draw his sword before the white was upon him. The thing that had once been a man lunged forward, its icy blue eyes burning with unnatural light. Benjen swung, his blade slicing into the creature's flesh, but it barely slowed. The other rangers sprang into action. Torches flared, steel flashed, and the night was filled with the sounds of desperate battle. But for every white they cut down, another seemed to rise from the snow, their bodies twisting unnaturally as they attacked. Benjen drove his sword into the chest of the white before him, pushing it back. "Fire!" he shouted. "Burn them!" One of the rangers flung a torch at the nearest white, and as the flames caught, the creature shrieked, its body convulsing as it turned to ash. The others quickly followed, setting the dead alight. The battle lasted only minutes, but when it was over, 3 of Benjen's men lay still in the snow, their throats torn open. The remaining rangers stood in shaken silence, their breaths misting in the frigid air. Benjen wiped his blade clean, his jaw tightening. This wasn't just another patrol gone wrong. This was something worse. The dead were walking, and he had a terrible feeling that Winterfell wasn't ready for what was coming. Back in Winterfell, Bran had trouble sleeping. The halls of the castle felt strange at night, too quiet, too empty. His father was gone. His mother spent most of her time alone in the solar, and Robb had started acting more like a man grown, always busy with duties. Bran hated feeling left behind, so he trained harder. Each morning he rose early and practiced with his wooden sword. Sir Roderick was relentless, correcting his form, forcing him to repeat the same movements over and over. Some days Bran's arms ached so badly he could barely lift the blade, but he refused to stop. One morning as he was practicing alone, Theon Greyjoy wandered over, smirking. "You really think you'll be a knight, little lord?" Theon asked, leaning against the training post. Bran scowled. "I know I will." Theon chuckled. "Knights don't exist in the north, Bran. That's a southern fancy." Bran tightened his grip on the sword. "Sir Roderick's a knight." "Aye," Theon conceded, "but the real warriors of the north don't need titles." Bran didn't answer. Instead, he swung his sword at the practice dummy, striking hard. Theon watched him for a moment, then shook his head. "You've got heart. I'll give you that." He tossed Bran a real dagger from his belt. "Here, try something with weight." Bran caught the blade, surprised by how different it felt from his wooden practice sword. He tested its balance, then turned to Theon. "Teach me." Theon raised an eyebrow. "You're serious?" Bran nodded. Theon hesitated, then shrugged. "All right, little Stark. Let's see if you've got more than just heart." He pulled his own blade free and fell into a ready stance. "Come at me." Bran took a deep breath and attacked. In King's Landing, Eddard Stark was beginning to see the truth. The capital was rotten. Lies spread like a sickness, hiding in the shadows of the Red Keep. His investigation into Jon Arryn's death had led him to troubling whispers. Whispers of a secret the late hand had uncovered. Something dangerous enough to get him killed. And the Lannisters were at the heart of it. But without the attempt on Bran's life, there was no direct evidence to tie them to anything. Ned's distrust of them was instinctual, but instinct wasn't proof. Still, the pieces were coming together. He had started noticing things. Joffrey's golden hair, the way the Queen kept her family close, the secrets spoken in hushed tones. Jon Arryn had been searching for something before he died, and now Ned Stark was following the same trail. He had a feeling that if he wasn't careful, it would lead him to the same fate. In the east, across the narrow sea, Daenerys Targaryen stood on the balcony of her chambers, staring out over the Dothraki camp. The Khalasar had grown restless. Her husband, Khal Drogo, spoke of conquest, of taking his warriors to new lands. Viserys, her brother, was growing impatient. "The time has come, Daenerys," he sneered. "We must take what is ours." But something inside her had changed. She was no longer the frightened girl who followed her brother's commands without question. She had begun to understand power. She turned to Viserys, her violet eyes cold. "The throne will be mine," she said, "not yours." Her brother's face twisted with fury, but he said nothing. Daenerys turned away, feeling the weight of destiny settling upon her shoulders. She did not yet know it, but the world was shifting, and she would play a greater role in it than anyone had ever imagined. Bran could feel it. Days had turned to weeks since his father left for King's Landing. The castle still stood strong, the walls still loomed tall, but something had shifted. His mother barely left her chambers. Robb spent his days buried in duties meant for a man grown, and the halls were filled with uneasy whispers. And then the Raven arrived. Bran had been in the training yard swinging a weighted practice sword when he noticed Maester Luwin hurrying across the courtyard, a scroll clutched tightly in his hands. Robb met him on the steps, and Bran saw his older brother's face darken as he read the letter. Bran set his sword down and ran over. "Robb? What is it?" Robb's grip on the parchment tightened. "Father's been arrested." Bran felt the words like a punch to the chest. "What? That's not possible. He's the hand of the king." Robb didn't look at him. "Mother needs to see this." He turned and hurried inside, leaving Bran standing in the cold, his heart pounding. This wasn't how things were supposed to happen. His father was supposed to uncover whatever secrets lurked in King's Landing and come home. He was supposed to make things right. Bran clenched his fists. He wasn't a child anymore. He was training every day, getting stronger. But no matter how hard he fought, he was still helpless. He hated it. The war that should have come sooner. In the great hall, Lady Catelyn sat rigidly in her chair, Maester Luwin beside her. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her hands trembling, but her voice remained steady. "We must act." Robb stood before her, the weight of his father's fate settling upon him. "I will ride south." Catelyn's gaze sharpened. "Number, you must gather the banners. If the Lannisters mean to keep your father, We will not beg. We will demand his release. Theon Greyjoy leaned against the stone wall, smirking. War, then? War, Robb confirmed. Bran's stomach twisted. He looked at his mother, his brother, the men who had gathered in the hall. They spoke of battle, of marching south, but all he could think about was his father, locked away in some dungeon, alone. A familiar voice spoke beside him. And what will you do, little lord? Bran turned to Theon, who studied him with amusement. Bran straightened. I'll fight. Theon chuckled. You're still a boy. Bran clenched his fists. Not for long. Theon gave him a curious look, then shrugged. Then we'd best make sure you're ready. In King's Landing, the lion tightens its grip. Eddard Stark knelt on the cold stone of his cell, his hands bound in chains. He had pieced together the truth. Joffrey was no Baratheon, but a Lannister through and through. He had been prepared to reveal it, to set things right, but he had underestimated Queen Cersei. The game had swallowed him whole. The door creaked open, and a familiar figure stepped inside. Pater Baelish. You should have listened to me, Lord Stark, Littlefinger said smoothly, his expression unreadable. King's Landing is not a place for honor. Ned met his gaze evenly. And yet here you are, playing your games. Baelish chuckled. The game is everything, and right now, you're losing. Ned remained silent. Littlefinger sighed. I could help you, you know.